Hello, I'm Dr. Richard Abels, Professor Emeritus from the United States Naval Academy. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is the reign of Æthelred II, known as Æthelred the Unready, and the second round of Viking wars, the Viking wars which resulted in the Danish conquest of England. So we have here a kingdom, the kingdom that was inherited by Æthelred, that was not well defended. And it wasn't well defended because it had been so successful in terms of war. Alfred had used the victory at Edington in order to completely reorganize the military institutions of Wessex. The problem with Vikings is that they were mobile, and that the traditional royal army, not only of Wessex, but all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, called the Third in Old English, that this royal army was made up of levies, ad hoc levies of landowners. By the time that they were raised to fight, it was difficult for them to be able to intercept the Viking raiders. Vikings have, in popular imagination, are great warriors.
Right.
The reality is that what Vikings were pirates. That's what they came for, the wealth. Wealth is not gained in battle. Wealth may be defended in battle, but it's not gained in battle. What they wanted to do was loot and pillage. They especially liked looting and pillaging monasteries, not for religious reasons. This was not a crusade, a pagan crusade. It's because that's where the wealth was.
Yeah.
I mean, monasteries were crammed with gold and silver liturgical objects. Hell, and they were defended by girly men. Perfect to be raided. And if you were raiding the monasteries, you'd also like to raid the towns for the same reason. That's where the wealth was. Vikings wanted to get silver. They loved to get gold. Silver was much more plentiful than gold, as it is today. And they also took young captives, healthy young captives, because one of the great commodities of this period were slaves. Viking Dublin, because the Vikings had established, basically they had established fortified towns in Eastern Ireland. Viking Dublin, which was a great commercial center, that one of the most important commodities being bought and sold in Dublin were slaves.
Yeah.
And these slaves were being exported to the Muslim East.
Yeah.
So Vikings were not really intent upon fighting battles, but they were willing to fight battles. They wanted to move quickly. They wanted to loot and pillage successfully, and they wanted to get away. So how do you counter them? Not with ad hoc levies of landowners. You need a standing army. So what Alfred did was he persuaded his nobles to change the way that the army was organized so that there would always be at least a portion of that army in the field. They'd be rotating contingents. And although the Anglo-Saxons fought on foot, in order to be effective, this army had to be on horseback.
Yeah.
And so what you had was a mounted mobile field force that would be able to chase down, intercept Vikings, slow down particularly by their loot and pillage, and get them before they could get back to their ships. But that wasn't sufficient. The Wessex that Alfred inherited was one that was virtually undefended. The only fortifications, if you could even call them that, were fences around the estates of nobles. Towns didn't have walls. Even English towns, even towns that were founded by the Romans that had stone walls, those stone walls were not repaired. Wow. They were basically broken stone walls. There had never really been a need for them. England didn't really have a history of siege warfare. Before the Vikings came, warfare was based upon small battles. Usually one battle settled the war. Now what Alfred thought was that what the kingdom really needed were fortifications. These fortifications, known as burhs, today we call them burrows, these fortifications, Alfred thought, had to be able to dominate the kingdom's lines of communication. And what he did was he ordered the construction or refurbishment of 30 such burhs.
Oh, wow.
Every Roman road, every harbor, and every ford over the Thames River would now have a burh. And that burh, in order to be effective, couldn't simply be a passive fortification. It had to be defended.
Yeah.
And that meant it had to have standing garrisons. And so what Alfred did was, for each of these burhs, he created a territorial district that was required to provide garrison troops and men to keep the defenses in working order. These are shires, and the shire became named after the major town of that. So the town of Wilton would be defended by Wiltshire.
Yeah.
And the result of this was that the landowners had to really buy into this, because this was extremely expensive.
Mm-hmm.
They were responsible for producing troops, not only for the fyrd, but also for the garrisons and for the upkeep of these boroughs. The only way that that could happen was because Alfred had been so successful at Edington, and his reputation had soared. And Alfred also seems to have acquired greater wealth, not only from his victories, but also from taking land, strategically placed land from the church. And by cajoling, persuading, and when he could, by compelling the nobles to his will. Ultimately, the greatest persuader was the prospect of the return of Vikings.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout the 880s and early 890s, Alfred had his nobles construct these 30 burhs, all of them garrisoned, and in order to connect them, he also created a beacon system and a system of military roads. Not the great Roman roads, but roads that were meant for the assembling and movement of troops. The common word for them was herepath, army path. But sometimes they were also called hervegs, from which we get the word highway.
Okay.
And these roads connected the estates of nobles with these boroughs, and between them and the Roman roads, armies could be assembled, moved effectively, and the garrisons were supposed to work in tandem with the mobile field force. What we call this today in modern military parlance is a defense in depth system. Yes, the Vikings could get in, but once they were in, they couldn't get out.
Yeah.
The system was tested in the 890s. In 892, what was called the Great Army, or sometimes the Great Heathen Army, operating in Francia, suffered a major defeat, coupled with a famine in Francia, which persuaded them to go across the Channel. Viking armies crisscrossed the Channel throughout the 9th century. They basically went wherever there was least resistance and where there was the most loot to be had. Francia was their preferred place because it was richer.
Right.
But if they couldn't do Francia, they would do England. They would do Britain. They came back in 892, and they found a quite different defensive system. Between 892 and 896, Vikings were able to penetrate Wessex once, and that Viking force didn't get out. Otherwise, what they had to do was attack around the periphery, and they were chased down by garrison forces, They were basically neutralized. And by 896, the war was pretty much over
Yeah.
without much damage being done. Alfred did one further thing. He created a small royal navy.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, he had a sort of the mind of an engineer, and he wanted also to have a better navy than the Viking fleets. And so what he did was he designed his own ships. He made them twice as large as the Viking ships, which turned out to be a mixed thing because, on one hand, it meant that they had larger crews, and if they engaged with Vikings on the shore, because that's usually what happened, or if they latched on and turned a naval battle into a land battle, they had more men and they could win. The problem, however, was that Viking ships were really designed to go upriver, which meant that they had a very, very shallow draft. His ships had a less shallow draft, and so they had a tendency of getting stuck. So, mixed.
Pros and
Nonetheless,
cons.
it's the beginnings of what England is going to be really proud of,
Yeah,
a Royal Navy.
it's true.
The result of all of this was that the Kingdom of Wessex was preserved and expanded. And what Alfred's son, daughter, and grandsons did was they used the system that Alfred had created for the defense of Wessex now to expand the power of the West Saxon dynasty northward. They conquered the areas that were under Danish control. In the 19th century, historians like to depict this, in fact, up until basically the 1960s, as being the Reconquest, sort
Yeah.
of the English version of the Spanish Reconquista. But just as the Spanish Reconquista is kind of a myth,
Yeah.
the Reconquest is a myth because it's not really a reconquest. What it is West Saxon expansion and aggression.
Yeah.
It's the West Saxon dynasty expanding northward. The result of that, however, was going to be the Kingdom of England.
Yeah.
And that Kingdom of England was created through this military conquest and through the establishment, the building of new boroughs, and the creation of shires around those boroughs. These boroughs became islands of royal authority, royal power. They became military centers, centers of justice, and perhaps, as importantly, the places for mints, as England became more and more a monetarized economy. All of this were royal. The power of the king was growing because of these administrative changes. Matching that was an ideological development. The English kings from actually even before Alfred, but Alfred really promotes this ideology of theocratic kingship. The king is not simply the ruler of a secular state. Church and state are united in the person of the king. The king appoints bishops. He appoints abbots. These men are spiritual leaders, but they are also the king's spiritual leaders, and they are royal administrators. The church is the king's church. Henry VIII would have loved it.
Yeah, he would have.
So you had an ideology of theocratic kingship. You had the institutions of government. You had a powerful royal state. And that's really all comes together in the reign of Edgar the Peaceable.